tardes a todos. Os queremos dar la bienvenida a todos los asistentes virtuales a este webinar organizado por la Universidad Isabel I, que tiene por título Movilidades y diferencias. ¿Son las migraciones efecto o causa de su desarrollo? Mi nombre es Antonio Gavira y seré el moderador de esta jornada. En todo momento estaré acompañado por Javier López, compañero del área de Geografía de la Facultad de Humanidades y Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad Isabel I. No obstante, es importante señalar que este webinar se centra en la exposición que va a realizar el profesor visitante Daniele Paragano, de la Universidad Niccolò Cusano de Italia. La charla se impartirá en inglés, aunque las diapositivas están traducidas al castellano, para que sea más fácilmente entendible. Una vez finalizada su exposición, podréis realizar todas las preguntas que veáis oportunas. Por ello, os animo a participar en el chat de YouTube. Las preguntas podéis formularlas en castellano, para que sean más fácilmente entendibles por todos los asistentes. Para finalizar esta pequeña presentación del webinar, os quiero hablar un poco del doctor Daniele Paragano, profesor de asignaturas relacionadas con Geografía Económica y Política y Geografía del Desarrollo en la Universidad Niccolò Cusano de Roma. Ha realizado un doctorado también en Geopolítica, Geoeconomía y Geoestrategia en la Universidad de Trieste. Fue profesor visitante en la Escuela de Geografía, Política y Sociología de la Universidad de Newcastle. También ha sido profesor invitado en diversas universidades europeas, algunas cercanas como la Universidad del País Vasco. Su investigación incluye cuestiones como la geografía militar crítica y la militarización del espacio, lugar, la geografía de la violencia, los paisajes y la movilidad. Finalizada esta pequeña introducción, quiero darle las gracias a Daniele por estar esta tarde con nosotros y comentarle que puede iniciar su exposición.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation and for the organization. Before starting, I'd like to thank to University Isabel I to invite me to accept my presentation, and also the colleague for the huge job done to do this event. For me, it's a very good pleasure to be here inside the framework of the Erasmus activities, and I hope there is in the future other possibility to continue our discussion also in other way. How Antonio told before, the presentation of today is regarding the relation of migration and development. It's a very important question. The important question is, the migration resolve the problem of the underdevelopment of some countries, or contribute to create some situation of underdevelopment of the same countries? And for this reason, we have to introduce both the themes. We can start from the development, because probably all of us have an idea of development, of what development can be, but it would be important to better define what can be considered development today. And the second step will be some consideration about migration situation today. And at the least of this presentation, we try to use these two concepts match in the same reflection to try to answer to the original question. Before starting, we have to introduce some information about the global framework. The global framework is important because migration and development and underdevelopment are are social activities that we have in all phases of the history, in all periods we can find migration, and the situation of humans in the world is the result of this continued migration process. But in every phases, migration changes, migration have different characteristics, and for this reason it's important to introduce the global framework and also the global perspective, because migration usually in Italy, but also in some other part of Europe, are considered only just with local perspective. We talk a lot about migration in Mediterranean or migration from North Africa countries to South Europe countries, but we have to consider that we live in a global social system, and also the unlucky event of this year certify how many relations we have. And so for this reason, especially in a geographical approach, following the geographical point of view, we have to approach with a global perspective. So we will discuss about migration, and not only to the migration in the Mediterranean or the other part of the world. So the main points of the global framework, the situation of today, of course, before COVID, because all of our analysis was done before COVID, the first point is the globalization. The globalization, as we know, is one of the most important change that we have in the last decades, because we don't reduce this social phenomenon only just to the increase of the global network transport system or the maybe internet connection. Those are points of the globalization approach, but especially students that are younger than us knows that we think in a global way. So the relation between communities and space are totally different. The network between space, time is totally changes. So we have to consider how the situation in terms of relations change radically in few years, in few decades. The second point is the role that neoliberalism have. What is neoliberalism? It is an economic approach, and it's the main approach in this period. All the countries usually approach in this way, and it's important because it creates a radical change in the role of the states, in the role of economy, in the role of economic actors. As you can read in the slide, I just write some point of neoliberalism. The approach is Bob Jessop approach, and we have a very reduced role of the state in the economy. The state as an economic actor. We note the increase of the relations among firms, the multinational firms that works in a global scale. The reduce of the regulation for private sector. And it's interesting for our perspective for two important point of view. At first, because economic activities have a great influence also to other social activities, because work, economic activities have a huge role in our life. And second perspective is very interesting because at the same time, we just introduced something that we can see in the future. At the same time, there is a very huge openness for firms, for enterprise to move to produce in different countries or to sell in other countries. But we can note as many countries reduce the possibility of movement of people. So it's a kind of paradox. The firms and the goods can travel, can move to a very global scale, but the same does not happen for a lot of people that don't have the same freedom to move. And we see in the future of the presentation, in the next slide, that it's a very important point in terms of migration. And okay, this is in English. The second slide about this global framework focus on other key points. The third key point is the so-called geopolitical chaos. Why we can talk about chaos? Maybe it's because we come from a different era in terms of geopolitical approach. We are not, I talk for me, so old, but in terms of geopolitical approach, we change radically in few times, because till the end of the last century, till the end of the 80s, the approach to geopolitics is more clear. We have the first, the second world, and the third world, the US system and the Soviet Union system that create, the Cold War approach, and the third world, which remain the not aligned countries. But the framework is clear, and we can include analysis in a clear framework, following an approach. Today is very, very complicated, because after the end of the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the changes in the world order, we don't have a clear framework, because the situation changed very, very fast. The international relation changed very quickly. The actors changes, and the way in which the actors usually can communicate and can change the relation changes very fast. And usually to my student, when we start our module, we start from the Truman, the United States President Truman speech of the 1949. And one reflection that we have is that in that period, it is not too many years ago, the communication goes through speeches and to presentation. And today we can see Joe Biden or some other political representative have a tweet, and with a tweet we can change their international relations. And this means that the communication is very fast, and also the relation can change very easily. But the international relations have a very huge role, because sometimes they can create war, and that wars can create a lot of refugees, influence the migrations, the development of the countries, and above all, the possibility to live and to have a good life for the people. The problem of refugees today is a very, very important issue, especially because it's focused in some countries. We can see what's happening in Syria, for example, or maybe the situation in Libya to remain in the Mediterranean. At the same time, we lost in few times a lot of part of social relation and social rights that we consider part of our culture. In some countries, a lot of people do not have personal rights guarantee. We can see in a lot of countries the use of incarceration, the reduce of freedom. And we note that in the newspaper every day we can see some situation frequently, and it influences a lot also the international relation. In Italy now we have the issue of Patrick Zaki, for example, a student, Egyptian student of University of Bologna, was in prison in Egypt, or other situations such as Giulio Regeni or something like this. So we have other forms of political international activities that change and that we consider just a few years ago, such as social rights that is guaranteed to people. At the same time, this situation is related to the whole environmental issues. In a few years, in few decades, sorry, we have to change our perspective about the relation that we as humans have with the other part of the natural system, and the role of natural hazard, or some point such as the climate changes. That is very, very important also for our team, because in migration, in a lot of countries are related to the environmental issues. We know that desertification increase in some part of Africa, for example, with a lot of problem. And when we talk about migration, we can't forget the environmental issues. A very complicated framework, and in this chaotic framework, we can discuss about what is development. As I told you, we start to talk about development at the beginning of the 50s, but not because the problems related to development before this period do not exist, but only because there are maybe few attention, few analysis of this theme. And for the countries in that period, we are in a very industrialization period for Europe, for the United States, for example. The person, the scholars, and also the government have to note that the same economic system and the same industrial possibilities are forbidden in a lot of countries. So there is a very huge difference between countries in terms of industrialization, in terms of economic growth. But why I talk about economic growth and industrialization? Because this is the original idea of development. If we read the books and the research in that period, we find a lot of articles, of books in the mainstream approach focus on economic growth, and economic growth can be found by industrialization. And in the original period of development, the 50s, there is a very strong connection between development, economic growth, and industrialization. But even if the debate in the maybe the other period move from this approach, we can note that in the culture, also in some political approach, in some scientific approach, this idea remains in a lot of public speech. When someone talks about development, refers to the economic growth and think of industrialization. It's mean that this idea is very deep rooted in the past, but also today. But as I told you before, this idea changed. This idea changed because some events suggest a different approach. The first important event was the growth of oil producer countries. During the 70s and the 60s, a lot of countries, such as the Arab countries, some Arab countries, increase their resources in terms of money through the production and the market of oil. But a lot of scholars knows that this, or maybe GDP increase, is not related to an equal distribution. It's very, very concentrated, and at the same time do not guarantee the same possibility to increase other part of the society. So this country, to be easy, become rich, but do not become developed as the other country did before. And this idea create maybe a first step of the debate about the possibility to call development and economic growth to refer to different concepts. The second step in the same period is related to what we said before, to the environmental issues, because in this period, in the 60s and 70s, started the debate about the resources. Today is normal to think that resources, natural resources, are limited. We know that we don't have the possibility to use natural resources as we want, because we have limits. We have limits in the resources itself, for example, oil or other minor resources, but we have other limits because we create pollution, and good air is not unlimited. But start to think about some limits to resources means to limits the possibility to grow, because the growth become limited and guaranteed only to some people. What before this period was promoted as a possibility for all countries become competitive is maybe just to have a easy example is when we are in a buffet and we have all the goods on the table and we have a lot of people. If the resources, the goods are limited, we know that there is competition about people. And totally different if we know that we have possibility in the future to hit what we want. But we have to be concentrated about this point because the resources is very limited, and for a lot of resources we arrive to the limits, especially in terms of natural resources as atmosphere, as also space. We are talking about geography, and we are very focused on space, and space is not unlimited. We know population is growing and the needs increase, so the space to produce goods increase. I'm sorry, I give now the slide in Spanish. And maybe those are the key point of the first step of development debate. So we start from starting point very focused on industrialization and introduce these 2 points: the limitation of resources and the idea that can be different way of development. And unfortunately, we have not time to analyze all the debate about the evolution of development, but the next steps maybe guide us to the idea of development of today, which is more related than before to the role of people, the participation of communities in the use of space, use of resources, in the idea about development. And probably you are young, and some of these points is part of your background, because for you probably it's normal that all the actors involved must be part of the decision. But do not think it was normal in the history, because before the 80s, the approach also in development policies was totally top-down. Some international actors decide which is the idea of development, which is the way to do it, and which is the action to produce in space. So, from the other point of view, some countries receive a model of development that they do not participate to create, and they have to accept. And you can imagine how difficult it is to have to change your idea to development because someone decided that this is development. So in the 80s, we have a split between the neoliberalism, but also the attention to the people, the participation, the approach of Amartya Sen based on the freedom. And as you can see in the slide, the role of scholarization of education. We are lucky. We are lucky because we have the opportunity to go to school, to study at university, to have webinars to discuss and increase our knowledge. But for many people in the world, there is not the same possibility. And why is important education? It's not to be considered important, maybe to find a better job or to find a social role. Yes, it's part of the use of education. Probably you are studying also to have more opportunities in your future. And I wish you all the best for your future. But above all, education scholarization is important to be more open people, different persons, more integrated in the communities, and to approach to the person and social issues in a different way. So for this reason, in the idea of development, scholarization education has a very important role because it's a kind of development. It's not only just functional to the development, but it's a way to consider development a country or a person. And maybe in the more contemporary approach, I want to introduce also some different perspective about development, because usually we consider the idea of society as unchangeable, but some movement such as the Maus or the Latouche approach propose a different approach, more focused on different organization of social value. It's not what must be confused with underdevelopment. It's different approach to the development, much focus on the possibility, human capabilities, as also Amartya Sen suggests, and less focus on the economy. I want to conclude this part about development with this more contemporary approach. And I forget to tell you before, we are in a social science, so it doesn't mean that the most contemporary is the better. It's important to have a common perspective, exclusive perspective to know all the approaches to define, which is, in personal opinion, the best. And we can start with the second step. Sorry, check the time to know if I'm in the good timing. Some information, some consideration about migration. Because as I told you before, migration is a traditional social activity. All humans migrate in their life. But in my opinion, if we consider this is as normal, as physiological, we reduce the importance of the maybe effort that the people have to do. Because in all migration, there is a personal effort to change, to be included in this process. And for this reason, not every people have the same possibility to migrate. As we told, we will say again later, sometimes people do not have possibility to move for maybe a low system or low regulation. But in some other case, there is personal limits, because it's not easy to migrate. It's not easy to live personal relation, network, a kind of comfort zone to create a new relation, a new life in different country. So we have to consider how much it is hard in all migration, for sure, for the women and the guys that migrates through the Mediterranean is more difficult. But also in the other migration, there is an effort. So we have to consider this point to have an idea about how much strong is migration. And maybe why we study migration, because in terms of geographical approach, it's important point of cultural exchange. All of us is related to migration, because all of us maybe can have some people that migrates. Probably in our life we do have this experience, or some of our parents, or our grandparents, or at least because our society include the migration issues, and at least because we are talking now. So if we are talking, we are including in the debate about migration. So for this reason, we do not have to separate migration to other social activities, because it's strictly related. And we don't, in my opinion, think that it's related only just to other people, because no one born as migrants. Everyone become migrant because decide to do this action or have to do it. But even if in some countries it seems that everyone have to migrate, even if it's not true, but it's just maybe a kind of narrative. But no one born to be migrant. It's a person that decide to do an action, and all of us can be in the future if we are not till now migrants. And other point about it, the relation about development is important for sure for our point of view. Because it's important. It's important because migration is very related to development, especially in terms of personal idea of development. Because before we analyze some key point in the literature about development, but every one of us have the personal idea of development, because there is not maybe a common idea. And for this reason, if we have or we have to do, we have the possibility to migrate, or we have to do migration, probably no one choose the same place, because someone prefers to go to the United States, someone else prefers to go to Sweden, some other people prefer to go to other countries. So migration is related to development, but not only in terms of absolute idea of development, but in terms of personal idea of development. But for sure is also related to different levels of development, and is an expression of the inequalities, because in terms of maybe totally theoretical, and I don't know if it's a good word, if everyone have the same possibility, the same opportunities, the same kind of life, no one migrates. It's a kind of paradox for sure. I anticipate. I think it's not a good word, but it's useful to consider how much the inequalities affect migration. And at the end, some points about the idea of voluntary, because in the literature there is compulsory migration or voluntary, but if we consider the social pressure, probably few people decided to be totally open to migration, to have migration totally voluntary. For more people, there is the system that suggests to migrate. And some other point about migration, and the age. Migration usually are done by people in working age. This data maybe is kind of maybe global approach, but it's important just to focus on the key point. And it's difficult to find all the people migrants. Yes, maybe even if it's increasing, the number of young persons that migrate is limited. So the main part of migrants is in the working age, and a lot of migrants have high skilled or maybe medium skilled. Especially compared to original countries. Because as we told before, and you can say in the previous slide, and it's a kind of selection. It's not easy. Migrate is not easy. So you have to maybe apart the academic title or the scholarship, scholarization, you have to you must have some personal characteristic to migrate because it's not easy. And even if not all the person have form skills, we can consider that person high skill because it's not easy. It's important to focus about it. And maybe just a note about the gender because a lot of women are migrants in this period, and it's also interesting that is increasing the number of women migrants alone, and it's important to consider the different role of gender in society. For this reason, I'd like to focus about it because it means that there is more opportunities because sometimes because migration is another kind of paradox because from one point of view, as we talked before, migration is necessary, but from another point of view, it's an opportunity because it's an opportunity that a lot of people do not have, also from social limitation. And the number of women that migrants alone can be considered in a positive perspective as a more possibility to go beyond some social limitation. Because maybe about migration is important to be focused about it. And there is, yes, probably in theory, no one wants to migrate, but everyone probably wants to have the possibility to do it. And we can arrive to the relations to analyze this relation of migration and development. I want to focus about the outgoing countries. Why this perspective? Because even if the number of migration is so-called north-north, so migration between developed countries increase, a lot of migration go from underdeveloped countries to developed countries, even if I have to put it, I don't like this classification. I use just to be more clear and I use probably enforcing common approach. But maybe I think that we also go beyond this classification because it's not representative today, especially because in what we call underdeveloped countries, there is a lot of situation in terms of social and economic and cultural approach better than other places in the development countries. So we have a lot of mistakes about the scale and about the idea of development. As I told you before, the idea of development today is more comprehensive. So it's very difficult to use limits to say this is development, this is not development. I just use this approach to be more clear because we don't have time today to focus on this point. But maybe if you want, we can discuss in the present time, but we have to go beyond also this idea to organize the spaces in terms of hierarchy. Spaces are not, or territories are not, can be put in some kind of hierarchies. Anyway, if we look in the original countries, the countries where people migrate from, we know that there is a very huge loss of human skills, human resources. And it's interesting to relate to the possibility to use the economic resources. Because in previous literature, about the 80s, 90s, scholars are very focused about remittance and say, okay, remittance are positive because increase the GDP of that country, so it's positive. But after some scholars notes that these resources coming from remittance are not useful to guarantee development because it's not automatic that GDP guarantee development. Because if no one can use these resources to create development, and we have a very strange situation that all this GDP can be used for consumption, and sometimes consumption of imported goods. So it's a positive effects in terms of GDP, in terms of goods, but maybe not too much positive in terms of resources, human resources and development. And for this reason, a lot of countries are reducing the possibility to go out from the country. And it's important because usually we follow an approach in which the limitation to migration are mainly related to the incoming countries. We know a lot of countries, also Europe, put a great effort to reduce incoming migration. But we don't consider that a lot of development countries do the same, because for the countries is a very huge loss, the people that go out. And maybe to arrive to some final consideration, I want to put some points about perspective, because I call the Western approach mainly based on economic themes, and in this way, it seems that migration is positive. But if we can change perspective and put perspective based on human possibilities, of the culture, of identity, the situation is totally different because it seems that migration can contribute the process of the underdevelopment of the countries. We can do the example of the scholarization, education. Education in social system, it's a very important social force. Communities give a strong force to create the education in a system and to guarantee to the citizen education. And as we told from a personal perspective, the role of education is not related only just to work. It's more a personal and a social role. If if more skilled people go out, a country do not lose only just the economic activities, but especially create a limitation to increase the knowledge of the country. And in this way, migration and development can be considered in a kind of vicious circle because people moves, but at the same time which people move, the country lost possibility and reduced the possibility for the new generations. So for new generation, even if there is not a great shock, the presence of migration create other migration, which can be this shock. Maybe it can be a great economic efforts, a radical change in the economic system, in the policy, in the social approach, and also in the approach. As we told before, in some places it seems that people are condemned to migrate, but it's not true because in a lot of countries there is possibility. And it's also interesting to put another perspective that in this debate there is maybe a kind of difficult to harmonize personal and social themes, personal and social issues. Because if some of us not living the same in a good way from his personal or her personal point of view, probably have all reason to migrate. But at the same time, to satisfy a personal reason is creating a social issue because reduce the possibility for the country to or the social structure to evolve. So it's difficult to find this equilibrium between personal and social role. How we can intercept this situation? A lot of countries reduce the possibility to migrate, or as I prefer, promote migration, but sustain a process of coming back. So people can migrate, but they do a great effort to give them the possibility to come back and to use for the community the knowledge, the experience that they have. So, as I told you, it's a very maybe complicated relation because there is not only point of view, and it's important because in the social sense, if we have only an only point of view, we have finished our evolution. But the perspective can change also frequently and fast. So I conclude my presentation. I want to thank you for your attention and the participation to this presentation. And now we have time and possibility to debate about this point that I want to focus. But as I told you before, there is not only this point of view. I like to listen also your different perspective. Anyway, if we don't have time today, or if you want to continue this debate in the future, or maybe if you want to visit us or exchange experience with us, this is my email and it's totally open to you. So I finish and I give the scene to Antonio.
Thank you, Daniel. Muchas gracias, Daniel, por la exposición realizada. Ahora vamos a comenzar el tiempo de las preguntas, en el que podéis realizar las cuestiones que veáis oportunas en el canal de YouTube. Yo trasladaré las preguntas y Javier López traducirá las preguntas que realicéis y la respuesta de Daniel. No sé si alguien se anima a realizar alguna pregunta.
Mientras tanto, si quieres, voy empezando yo.
Si quieres, puedes realizar tú la primera, Javier.
De las posibles cuestiones, pues voy a proponer. Bueno, voy a dirigirme primero a Daniele en inglés y luego formular una serie de preguntas en castellano y después las traduzco. Thank you very much, Daniele. I think it's a very interesting presentation. I think you have chosen a topic very interesting, very related, as you say, to our lives in many ways. We see this phenomena in the TV every day, and or maybe we have familiar ancestors which travel for another country, many different situations. So I think that make it more interesting for us, and especially for me, is very interesting. And I congratulate you for this presentation. I'm going to ask first the question in Spanish and then translate it, so then you answer, and then translate your answer. Vamos a ver, le felicitaba en primer lugar a Daniele por esta interesante presentación, ya que es, bajo mi punto de vista, ha escogido una temática relacionada con la actualidad que vemos en todos los telediarios actualmente e incluso, ¿no? De una u otra manera seguramente pues conocemos a gente que ha emigrado o incluso pues tenemos, pues como es mi caso, a lo mejor familiares pues que han emigrado, ¿no? En España y en Italia pues ha habido mucha gente, ¿no? que ha emigrado fuera, ¿no? A otros países, América Latina, a Estados Unidos o incluso en los años 50 a Europa, ¿no? Entonces, la pregunta que quiero formular es, había presentado, había pensado un orden, pero lo voy a alterar porque después de la interesante presentación que ha realizado Daniele, pues voy a preguntar por un orden diferente, viendo sus conclusiones. Y es al respecto de la distribución, o sea, el impacto que tiene el desarrollo en las migraciones, que como bien dice Daniele, es importante, ¿no? Pero la cuestión es, las migraciones estamos condenados a que se produzcan, tal y como yo lo entiendo, porque el desarrollo se concentra en unos pocos lugares en los países. Por ejemplo, en Estados Unidos, casi toda la población está concentrada en la costa este o en la costa oeste. En el caso concreto de España, si se mira la concentración demográfica, pues se observa claramente que está todo concentrado en Madrid, Barcelona, País Vasco, Valencia también, Andalucía, determinadas ciudades, Sevilla y Málaga, ¿no? Y en Italia, pues hasta donde yo sé, también se concentra en el norte. Entonces, dado que el crecimiento, digamos, se distribuye de una manera desigual, pues tiene que necesariamente producirse migraciones y es algo que, aunque como bien dice Daniele, puede ser tiene aspectos positivos, pero también negativos, de producirse por pienso yo, por este motivo. Entonces me dispongo a traducírselo. Daniela, I'm going to translate you this question. And I was reflecting on your presentation. And exactly as you say, migration and development go hand in hand, right? But the fact is that development is not equally distributed, especially distributed. Development, for instance, in the United States, is located very clearly in the eastern coast or in the western coast. Or I was putting the example of Spain. Development is clearly located in 4 cities, more or less, Madrid, Barcelona, and also region-based country. Valencia too is another important city. And I believe knowledge is more or less the same, is more or less all the development located in the north, right? So having considered this thing in mind, I believe migrations will take place, will never end and will never stop because of this, because development be located happen that from lower or undeveloped, they used to call in undeveloped places, have to travel to or try to travel to developed places, even within the country, of course, it has internationally. So what are your views on that?
Okay, I don't listen very well at the end of your question, but probably I understand the topic, especially because
Last part, or it's okay?
No, because a little Spanish can be understand for me, and so I can listen in the first version. Yes, for sure, this is a process that can end in the future. But as we told before, can we imagine a world or a country without migration? I think it's not the solution, because everyone's probably want to find something different and something better. But I want to do a little step before this topic to maybe to ask you also, to ask to everyone you what we think about development is, because sometimes we underestimate the possibility of the different part of the world. For example, you say in the correct way, in the Italy, usually the development is concentrated in the north. So we had a very huge internal migration from the south to the north. And also in this period, a lot of students from the south go to the north. But I think that is important to also to try to change this perspective, to focus on also to the possibility that all places can have. Yes, economic activities are concentrated, as you perfectly told, in the eastern or western coast of the United States, but it not mean that in the other part of the world we can have possibility also to create a different kind of development. And in this period, in this year, probably all of us think about it, because our relation with the space changes, the concentration is reduced. And I don't know if in Spain the debate also move in this way. In Italy, we discuss about the so-called South work, because a lot of people using, as we are doing now, the web, move from the north to the little city in the south and works from there. So the concentration is an important point, and all the concentration produce migration today, in the past, and in the future. But we have also to maybe change our perspective to pay attention about the possibility, because we have material issues, but we have also some narrative. And in some part of the world, we note in some part of in our country too, often society produce the idea that migration is the natural way for people in that part of the world or in that part of the countries. So we have to work to reduce the necessity to migrate to material part, for sure, but also to the narrative, and to analyze the possibility that all the territory can have. On the other point of your interesting question is about the scale, because as I told you before in the presentation, usually we use the great aggregate, the countries, the continents. We talk about the migration from Africa to Europe, but we can be sure that every place in Europe is better than every place in Africa, because someone in some part of Africa, in some big cities maybe, can have more possibility than in some rural village in Europe or in the middle of United States, as you told before. So we have also to analyze in terms of scale, and to consider that not every continent, every great aggregate have the same situation. But anyway, I'm totally agree with you. This is a process that we have now and we have in the future. And only just to move to a more equal distribution, we can change the migration to possibility from the situation that we have now, that a lot of people must migrate. I imagine a society in which every one of us can migrate, but no one must migrate. Probably, I don't know if is your question, because as I told you, there is a connection.
I said your answer for our viewers, and correct me please if I'm wrong.
Okay.
If you can understand.
Oh, sorry, because it's too long. Sorry.
No problem, no problem. Bueno, la cuestión que le he formulado a Daniele contesta que, bueno, que efectivamente que es un factor, claramente. Que está de acuerdo en que la concentración de riqueza es un factor. Pero claro, él dice, no es lo único, ¿no? Es decir, no todas las regiones que se consideran subdesarrolladas pueden estar necesariamente abocadas a migrar, ¿no? Primero tenemos que trabajar en la dirección de evitar esa migración, o por lo menos que sea una elección puramente personal, pero que no sea algo obligado. Y luego habla también del fenómeno de la escala. Es decir, claro, muchas veces hablamos, es que África es pobre, ¿no? O digamos que hay mucha pobreza y se concentra ahí y que por lo tanto se producen fuertes territorios. Pues estoy de acuerdo con lo que dice Daniel, porque efectivamente existen grandes concentraciones de riqueza en determinadas ciudades de África, por ejemplo. De hecho, son grandes polos de atracción de población, determinadas ciudades de África. Bueno, estoy pensando, creo que Sudáfrica, si no me equivoco, en República Sudafricana, y si no me equivoco, creo que Nigeria, determinadas ciudades, como productor de petróleo que es, pues también tiene una importante capacidad de atraer población, ¿no? Entonces, claro que es esa, bueno, que coincide esencialmente, pero que debemos aspirar a que no sea una obligación, sino pues una opción. Vale, también me gustaría, no question, me gustaría formular otra cuestión al respecto de la gente cualificada que emigra, que emigra. Porque me ha parecido muy interesante, he apuntado por aquí que era un 21% de las migraciones son de gente cualificada. Y primero, me gustaría saber exactamente qué es lo que se entiende por gente cualificada en ese 21%. Y la verdad es que me pregunto, es verdad que migre gente cualificada es un perjuicio para el país de origen, claramente, porque pierde, es lo que se denomina brain drain, ¿no? O sea, cerebros, que le llaman en esa denominación en inglés, pero también tiene este aspecto que me gustaría someter a la consideración de nuestro ponente, que es que estoy pensando en el caso de la India. Muchos ingenieros indios se van a trabajar al Silicon Valley, bueno, muchos, antes, algunos, van a trabajar al Silicon Valley, adquieren conocimientos, digamos, de vanguardia dentro de este campo, ¿no? De mejor de la informática, y luego crean sus propias industrias, ¿no? Crean su propia riqueza cuando vuelven, porque muchos deciden volver. Entonces, hasta donde yo sé, de hecho, cuando Donald Trump endureció la política de inmigración en Estados Unidos, creo que quería dar cierta carta blanca, y por ejemplo en el Reino Unido con el Brexit también lo querían dar cierta carta blanca para el personal cualificado, porque primero le interesa, obviamente, a estos países que reciben, pero incluso hasta cierto punto, cuando tú recibes de vuelta a esa gente, esa cualificada, también puede ser para el país de origen. Quería conocer la perspectiva de Daniel sobre eso. Me pongo a traducir por lo que a lo mejor no, porque me consta que entiendes un poquito el español, pero bueno, voy a traducirlo porque será así más seguro. Entonces, I try to translate to this question. I was asking about, you said before that 21% of migrations were of qualified people, very highly qualified people. And that thing was quite interesting to me. And obviously that my type of migration is obviously a problem for the country of origin, which loses qualified people, and it gains the share of people who is not qualified will grow. So that is really a problem for the country of origin. But I was asking if that is necessarily a problem, and I will explain why. Because, for instance, in these places like I was thinking Silicon Valley, which is a place, as you know, but I will explain for the viewers, that the high-tech companies are concentrated, like Google, like Apple, and all these high technology corporations are concentrated there. And they used to recruit, they used to bring qualified people from all around the world. And as far as I know, they recruit many Indians because they speak English, but no, they are not limited to Indians. And actually, this I was wondering if that could be a benefit also for the country of origin. Why? Because when which Indian engineers who travel from India to United States, when they learn capabilities, when they learn how to do high tech and how to innovate on high tech fields, they will come back. They will most likely come back to their country of origin, and they will bring knowledge with them. And actually, I think that is good benefit for the country of origin. So maybe in long term, depending on which kind of people is going abroad, of qualified people is going abroad, maybe it's not a bad thing, not necessarily a bad thing. I wanted to know your views about this issue.
And in your previous question, and we talked about it before, you introduced the concept of the concentration. And the concentration is also the concentration of knowledge. And unfortunately, in this period, we have a huge concentration of knowledge in some places, such as the example that you have done, and I totally agree with you. In Silicon Valley, there is a great concentration of the knowledge about IT and so on. And this is the main problem, because the natural process is to concentrate, because all the engineering decide to go to Silicon Valley. But to make positive migration, as you told before, some government can give to people that decide to move an opportunity to come back. And this opportunity is to have the possibility to use this knowledge. And you are talking about India, and I have in mind the situation of Bangalore, in which the huge IT district is created also in connection to Silicon Valley. And this is for sure a good policy of migration from a country that have a huge reduction, a huge number of people that migrants. But and also, as I told before, it's important for all the countries, because in Italy, for example, the political debate is totally focused on the limitation to incoming person, but maybe is not focused on what I think is the main problem. A lot of young people that, in terms of high skill, finish the degree or gain the PhD and don't have the possibility to continue the career in Italy and go in the United States, UK, or in other parts of the world. So also in the countries such as Italy, we have this problem with the people that move out, the young people that move out. And we don't have a good policy to come back. Because the problem is that concentration is physiological, such as the concentration of economic, as you told before, is the concentration of knowledge. How can do a country use this opportunity to introduce to come back, to let the people come back? And probably I understand also in the part of Spanish question, the problem of the selection. I'm not totally agree also with the European approach about it. The boundaries of the country can be a pass different for high skilled and not high skilled, because in this way, if we close in Europe, in the United States, or in UK in this case, only just 2 high skilled, the process of concentration expand, and we don't reduce the inequalities. So I don't agree with the approach that a lot of countries have in these people to say, okay, we let all the high skilled the possibility to come in, because it's not a global and social perspective.
Yes. Thank you very much for your interesting answer. I will translate it for our audience. Bueno, me la respuesta de Daniele, la verdad es que para aquellos no lo hubierais entendido la respuesta que ha dado él, pues básicamente se reduce a que efectivamente es un factor, ¿no? Importante, lógicamente, el que el país de origen sea capaz de traer de vuelta el personal cualificado que está fuera, ¿no? El ejemplo de Bangalore, que es otro ejemplo similar al de India, que efectivamente, bueno, pues hay políticas para intentar gente cualificada. Y dice que, claro, esto no se centra solamente en los países, digamos, de menor, entre comillas, desarrollo, sino también, pues, por ejemplo, ponía el caso de Italia, ¿no? Dice Italia, pues, que en muchos casos, y yo creo que esto es algo muy compartido por muchos jóvenes españoles también, pues que terminan una licenciatura, terminan un grado, terminan un doctorado y resulta pues que no aparece, que no pueden trabajar y no les queda más remedio que emigrar. Entonces, bueno, pues eso es algo que lamentablemente ocurre. Otra parte también, de una manera muy acertada, yo creo, que se está imponiendo, digamos, una migración de clase, ¿no? De manera que la gente cada tiene libertad para moverse libremente en el país, que es un poco lo que decía ocurriendo en Estados Unidos. El Brexit se ha planteado claramente en esos términos, es decir, vamos a limitar gente menos cualificada y vamos a pues, gente más cualificada. Y bueno, la verdad es que nosotros pues me uno a la crítica de Daniele. O sea, realmente al final es, digamos, una especie de migración clasista, ¿no? Entonces, pues efectivamente, creo que es una última cosa que formularle a Daniele. One last question about about this issue of migration. You consider, as you said, and the issues like development, like economic growth, they are not necessarily. And I wanted to ask you about technology transport. I was thinking, when you were exposing you were doing your presentation, I was thinking, actually the number of migrate throughout grew. And I think it's a very interesting statement that you made, that history is a history of migrations. And it's true. I believe it's true. Actually, I was thinking in the time that Caesar tried to stop Swiss in his famous book, De Bello Gallico. He tried to stop Swiss people from Switzerland. They wanted to move to the southern east side of France. Or the migrations that Spain or Italy did in the 19th century. They went in thousands especially to the Americas, and millions during the 20th century. And I was thinking, in part, that may be by this technology of transport, because the ships every time were bigger, and they have more capacity, and they were more fast, and so that is why that explains how the United States is today has I think because many of them in a extent that size, it depends on the migrations from Europe of European people to the United States. So my point and my question is, to what extent do you think the transport technology has also by this that as is supposed, I think it's quite likely that the technology of transport will improve in the following years. So that might lead us to predict that will increase even more. Thanks to this, I would like to know your opinion about this. But please let me say this long question in Spanish, because I realized I forgot to say to our viewer. I will say in Spanish first, and then if you don't mind, you answer me. estimada audiencia, me he dirigido al siguiente a Daniel, que me parecía interesante el fenómeno de la tecnología del transporte, ¿no? La tecnología del transporte, como bien ha dicho Daniele, yo creo que ha tenido su importancia a lo largo de la historia. Como muy bien decía Daniele, la historia en gran medida es la historia de las migraciones, ¿no? Las grandes migraciones que se produjeron, pues le ponía el ejemplo de cuando Julio César pues impedía la migración de los suizos hacia el sureste francés, perdón, o cuando pues en fin, las grandes migraciones asiáticas que se produjeron durante la Edad Media, o pues la cantidad de migrantes españoles e italianos, por ejemplo, que en el siglo XIX y XX fueron a las Américas, ¿no? La cuestión es, da la impresión de que el tamaño de las migraciones es, en cierto modo, proporcional a la tecnología del transporte, ¿no? Entonces, considerando que van a seguir mejorando la tecnología del transporte en los próximos años, cabe pensar que las migraciones van a crecer de manera proporcional. So, if you like, anytime you like, and give me your impression about that.
It's better when you start in English because I have more time to think to the answer. And yes, and as you say, the transportation have very important role in the migration and in the future. But you are probably more expert than me in this point. The transportation system can give more possibility to move and to move people in the world. But in my point of view, another important things is the approach to migration, because the evolution in the transportation system today create a very maybe particular situation compared to the past, in which migration is not necessary to be considered from migrants' point of view as maybe for all their life. So migrants today can have the possibility to think, to come back, and sometimes we don't think only just to the migrants in the Mediterranean, but the migrants that have the possibility to use common transportation technology, transportation system, can come back frequently. And it's very interesting to for the integration, because there is not the necessity to be integrated in the arriving community, because you have one step in your original community, because you can come back, for example, from Italy to Spain, or from Spain to Italy. In my opinion, it's difficult to think about migration, because when it's possible to travel, when will be possible again to travel? In 2 hours, in 3 hours, you can come back. So every 2 weeks, maybe if some of us, maybe for example, if some of you works in Italy, you can come back to Spain every week or every 2 weeks. So you don't lose the connection. And in this point, there is also an important role of information and communication technology, because migrants do not close with the original community, because maybe you have some chat, some message, some call, and do not maybe finish the connection with this original community. And for this reason, it's important to analyze the numbers, as you perfectly say, but also the kind of migration and how migration is changing.
Thank you very much for your answer. Bueno, pues your answer. efectivamente, concuerda, está de acuerdo en que efectivamente las migraciones pues, pueden verse influidas por el transporte, de la cual no se dice que, en fin, que bajo su punto de vista, claro que. Y luego, pues también habla de la importancia, ¿no? de la integración, de que no es lo mismo, digamos, determinados ámbitos, a lo mejor que estamos más cercanos, como por ejemplo España e Italia, pues no se produce la misma integración que con migrantes de otros ámbitos mucho más distantes. A este respecto hablaba de la importancia que es de la información y la comunicación, ¿no? que facilitan este proceso. Así que, pues no sé si he recogido básicamente, I'm not sure if I translate more or less your answer, more or less. No sé si hay
Gracias,
alguna
Javier.
cuestión.
Quería hacer una pequeña cuestión porque veo que en el chat de YouTube no se ha realizado ninguna pregunta y quería hacer una pequeña cuestión para ir finalizando el webinar de esta tarde, que creo que ha sido bastante interesante, sobre qué opinión tiene Daniele sobre lo que nos depara con respecto a las migraciones una vez que hayamos olvidado la pandemia actual.
Not translated. For our English viewers. Vamos a ver. The question is put in Antonio is very interesting, but under my point of view, is how do you think will impact after the end of COVID? Let's think ends very soon. But how do you think will it have any impact on migration? Not? How will it be? What's your impression about that?
It's very, very difficult because we need the crystal ball to see the future, but especially because we don't have some point to analyze the future really. I fear, because really I fear, that this situation change all our relation with the space, because all movement can be reduced in terms of tourism and can be reduced in terms of migration. And as I told you before, I think it's not positive, because if from one point of view migration is not good for people that have to migrate, is also the best opportunity, like global society, that we have to answer to the inequalities sometimes, but also to improve our knowledge. Because if we don't exchange, we have a few possibilities to increase our knowledge. And I suppose that migration can change their characteristics. So the temporary migration can be also substituted by other kind of relation, but the necessary migration maybe become more difficult in the future, and this is a very problem for people that need to answer to their problem in this way, and also probably the control in the boundaries and the limitation increase the process of selection and can create what do you say before, the class migration. And for this reason, I think that we have pay many attention to create a different, more open approach, because in this period every country is closed, and to create an openness to all people, I think, is necessary in the future.
Pues, translate your answer. Dice que efectivamente que es muy complicado saber qué es lo que va a pasar. Lógicamente, mágica para saber por dónde los tiros, pero que bueno, que él entiende que tiene aspectos positivos, que mejora el conocimiento, pero también probablemente la migración en el futuro, y yo coincido completamente con la respuesta, pues va a la dirección de clase. Es verdad. El Reino Unido lo tiene muy claro que va en esa dirección, o por lo menos van a intentarlo. Probablemente también, con Trump era así, cuál será la nueva presidencia del gobierno, y probablemente la Unión Europea, pues yo creo que no se va, no. Entonces, seguramente más controles fronterizos y va a haber pues más migración, ¿no? Por mi parte. Have any other question? I thank you for the presentation. I would like to give you congratulations for all the interesting presentation, and please to stay in this webinar, to Antonio, and thank you for you, Daniel.
No,
Sorry?
I thank you for the possibility and for the questions. It's a very, in my experience, I have a lot of Erasmus activities, but it's very interesting in this way and with a lot of questions. So thank you very much for the space and the question and the idea also.
Muchas gracias, Daniel.
Pues agradecidos por también este webinar y a todos los compañeros de la universidad que han colaborado. Así que por mi parte no tengo más y te cedo la palabra.
Javier, es que no se ha escuchado el final que has comentado.
Perdón.
Se te ha cortado un poco la conexión.
Que no tengo nada más que comentar. Que muchas gracias por todo a todos.
Indicar solamente darle las gracias a Daniel y a Javier por haber participado también en el webinar. Y no sé si quieres comentar mañana el webinar que también participará Daniel, que es dirigido por ti, Javier, por si quieres ofrecer algún tipo de información relativo.
Efectivamente. Aprovecho este espacio para animar a la audiencia a ver otro webinar interesante que tendrá lugar mañana a las 6:30. Y en este caso sería sobre la experiencia, sobre el papel del geógrafo desde la perspectiva profesional y desde la perspectiva académica, el caso de Italia, que lógicamente es lo que me conoce pues Daniele, ¿no? Entonces va a ofrecernos un de, bueno, pues cómo puede, qué geógrafo y cómo está la geografía, ¿no? En este país. Os quedáis todos invitados a las 6:30 mañana, 11 de mayo.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Javier. Daros ambos de nuevo las gracias y también mandar un saludo a todos aquellos que han estado viendo el webinar durante estas cerca de 2 horas. Lo hemos extendido un poco en la extensión con respecto a lo que estaba previsto. Un saludo a todos.
Venga.